much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm amazed by what I've just heard today. This wasn't so much a history of finances, it was more akin to Grimm's fairy tales. Let me explain my understanding of the economics of the last 10 years or so. In 1997, when the Labour Party came into government, we had a national debt of around £350 billion. Too high, I fully accept. But the important thing was that the deficit was zero. Somebody from a sedentary position says Labour went on to reduce the national debt further, and indeed they did, Mr. Chairman. They accepted the then previous Conservative government spending plans, and for 2 years they paid off the national debt. We were running a surplus, and I congratulate them for it. And then for some reason, in about the year 2001, they suddenly decided to start spending. I'm sure it had absolutely nothing to do with the election that started to loom, of course. They began spending at a rate that must have averaged well over £30 billion a year, because by 2008, before we had had any problems at all with the banks, they had increased the size of the national debt from 350 billion, I will give way, to 650 billion pounds. I give way.
Order. I think before you take the intervention, can I just say that whilst context is important and historical debate is very interesting, the motion and the discussion is about the budget as it applies to Wales. So when you make contributions, could you please measure that in the contributions that you do make and the interventions? Mr. Evans.
Way. Would he answer one question? Why did the then Shadow Chancellor, who's now the Chancellor of the Exchequer, commit to following Labour's spending plans for 2 years under the next Tory government?
Mr. Chairman, the then Shadow Chancellor was not aware at the time of what the true scale of the problem actually was. For example, we are only now beginning to discover the role of PFIs and the amount of money which that has cost. The Member of Parliament for Nice made several references to the amount of schools and hospitals which his government had indeed built. But what he failed to mention was that these weren't built using the money which is now on the national debt. These were all built out of PFIs, and we will therefore be paying the cost for another 30 years or so to come, which is of course one of the reasons why we've had to take the drastic steps that we have in the budget, because the 950 to £1 trillion debt that we have on the books is not the full story. In fact, there are many independent observers who estimate that it is double what that £1 trillion figure is if one takes account of the PFIs, the liabilities on things like Network Rail, Metronet, and of course the public sector pension liabilities. So we have a very, very serious problem, and it is that which is the reason why we are having to take the drastic steps that we are taking in the budget. Now, the member. I will give way.
Because he, like I, has worked in business, and would he not accept, even if we were to accept the numbers he's just presented to us, that neither in business nor in a national economy does one cut one's way to growth? And that is the very clear message of this budget, and it's a clear message that he, having worked in business, should understand.
Well, I can assure him that all the figures I've given will be on the record. You can check them. Let me give him another figure. In the last financial year of his government, the tax revenue was around £520 billion, and the spend was £680 billion. We had a deficit of £160 billion. That is completely unacceptable. And what he and I both know is that no business could have operated on those sorts of figures. No business could possibly have been spending at that level above its revenue. Now, one thing that I don't understand, I genuinely don't understand this, is that all measurements are quoted of the deficit are quoted in terms of general GDP. I genuinely don't know why it is that we don't look at the level of deficit as a percentage of the level of revenue, because that to me is a far more relevant figure. And 160 billion as a percentage of 520 is a very high amount indeed.
Because it is a very simple answer to that, and that's where the analogy between the business and the national economy falls down, is that In respect of a national economy, one can borrow over a far longer term and at much lower rates than a business can borrow, just as we had our debt serviced over 40 years. And that is what allows you, under a Keynesian understanding of economics, to invest in order to grow.
Well, now, there we come to the cracks of the difference between that side of the house and this side, whether one is a Keynesian or a member of the Austrian school. And as somebody married to a Schwabish Hungarian, he won't be surprised that my sympathies are entirely Germanic in this field. May I remind the honourable member, through the utmost respect, personally, that it was he who raised the business analogy, and I actually think it's a very good one. And he would know that any business that operated in the way that the nation was operating would actually have been declared bankrupt very, very quickly indeed. And he then tries to go on, leaving that analogy behind, and say that we can borrow over much longer periods of time. In fact, the member for Nice, when he was making his speech, posed the question, why was it that people were willing to lend to the United Kingdom? I thought he put it rather well. Why was it that we were able, as a government, to borrow vast amounts of money, which is something I think I might throw back at him at some point. I will, but then may I answer the question, since it's been posed. I remember a few years ago I went to visit the European Bank, and I was asking about the chances of Hungary entering the euro. Not that I actually am a big supporter of the euro, but if Hungary had entered, it would have been convenient to me for personal reasons. And I was told laughingly by the banking officials that the problem with Hungary was, and I remember they said this, they said, the thing about you politicians is that you'll make all sorts of promises before an election, but you never actually keep them, which is a good thing. He said the trouble with the Hungarians is they make all sorts of promises about what they will do before an election, and then when they're elected, they try and carry them out. And he said, and that's why we can't possibly let them anywhere near the euro at the moment. The reason why so many people were willing to still lend Britain the money is because Britain has never actually defaulted on its debts in 1,000 years. And the ratings agencies, when they looked at Britain in the run-up to the last general election, all agreed that all of the parties at the time, Labour and Conservative, certainly the parties that were likely to be the major party of government, had both said very clearly that after an election they would take drastic measures to prune public expenditure and get the deficit down. And on that basis alone, they were happy to lend to us, although they made it quite clear that we were very close to being downgraded from our AAA rating status, and would have been had we not taken the steps that they required after the election.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Looking at the business analogy, he will know that directors in any business have to form a judgment on the statement of whether the business is a going concern. In other words, able to meet its liabilities as they fall due within the course of the next 12 months. Applying that analogy, as one's invited to do by the honourable member for Pontypridd, what assessment would he make about the situation that our country was in at the time of the last general election?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable member. I think it bears a lot of parallels with the situation in 1979, when the IMF were on the brink of having to step in and take a long, hard look at the finances of the country, because we were spending far more money than we actually took. Now, I don't accept that we can blame this on the banks, as the member for Nice had tried to do. By his own analysis, the banking crisis cost us £90 billion. Well, I believe that the Treasury Select Committee looked at this and said that although it was hard to come up with a figure, they estimated that it would be about £50 billion. I accept that that report came out some time ago and things may have changed. They also said that it may cost us rather a lot less than that, because a lot of that money was put into the banks in the form of shares, which may at some point result in a net profit for the government. But let me take the honourable member for Nice, that is word. Let us accept that it has cost us £90 billion. Well, when the honourable member's government left office, the national debt was £950 billion. £350 billion of that was the responsibility of the government in 1997. So let's say that £440 billion of that debt of £950 billion was not arguably the fault of the party opposite. That still leaves around £500 billion that clearly was the fault of the party opposite. They can't get away from this. They can't say, on the one hand, that the whole thing was down to the banks, when the maximum that we've given to the banks is 100 or 90 billion out of a total of £950 billion. What about all the other hundreds of billion pounds? Whose fault is that? Now we come to the crux of the opposition party's economic thesis, which is that if we spend lots of money that we don't actually have, then somehow this will create growth, which will mean that we can pay off all the money that we've spent and have some sort of profit left over. And this, I find, this economic argument, which I suppose is Keynesianism, has been disproved on so many different occasions. It was finally, I thought, put to rest by a former Labour Prime Minister in 1978, Callaghan, who I think said, "We used to think you could tax and spend your way out of recession. I tell you in all honesty, conference, that is no longer possible." It was a Labour, I believe either a Prime Minister or Chancellor of the Exchequer who said that to a Labour Party conference in 1978, because they realised, as most people understand, that you cannot simply borrow money, spend money which you don't have, and hope that that is going to create some sort of a profit which will allow you to pay the whole thing back. They accepted it prior to the general election when they were happy to talk about cutting public expenditure to a level of around 4/5 of the amount that the Conservative Party and Liberal Democrat Party are now doing. And frankly, it is, to say the least, very disappointing that finding themselves in opposition, they are now opposing every single cut that the government are making and refusing outright. And we saw the member for Neath wriggling like a fly on a hook when he was asked this question, to say what cuts they would actually make when they would make 4/5 of the same cuts that we would have made. Mr. Chairman, I know there are many other people who want to speak today. I would like to end the fairy tales and to talk about finance. We had more humbug from the Member of Parliament for Neath than one would have found in the old pick and mix at Woolworths. But it was the member for Islwyn who made the most sensible comment today when he said that we all know that in business, poor performance leads to the sack. The members opposite have been given the sack, and it is now up to the Conservative and Liberal Democrats to get the finances in order to get this country back on its feet again.